we feel the issue around kangaroo management is really crucial. And it's not just the culling of the kangaroos that's important, it's what is the thinking and behaviour that lies within government that actually can see this as a strategy that's appropriate. So it's not just a single important issue, both for the nature of the kangaroos themselves and for ourselves responding to that policy, but what does it really say about a government that actually moves ahead and is quite secretive about this policy?
So Canberra is pursuing a policy of rapid population growth, as you probably noticed, mostly through invited economic immigration. And in case you thought that people were banging on the door to come here, the government actually advertises, and every single state government in Australia advertises very actively for immigrants. And I just found a website for Canberra. They will tell you that they have that it's all the Australian government's responsibility, but it's actually the state governments which are into the land use planning and the selling and buying of land that encourage it. Next one, if somebody, next. Okay, so that's just an idea. People often believe that the only immigrants who come to Australia are refugees or asylum seekers, but those are actually the proportions. We've got planned economic immigration of around 250 to 300,000 a year. We've got natural increase, births and deaths of about 150,000. And we've got about 20,000 refugees, asylum seekers, etc. a year. And we also have a huge floating population of short-termers, international students and so on, who buy houses legally if they sell them after a year. So you've got enormous pressure on housing and land. Next one, I guess, thanks. Canberra's human population problem. In June 2016, the A.C.T. Southwest was the fastest growing area in Australia. It grew by 127.3% according to the ABS. Canberra's population could increase to 904,000, of course it's never exact, by 2061 according to new projections. Predicting a population growth for at least 98% within 50 years, A.C.T. population projections for 2061 suggest that the A.C.T. might exceed Tasmania's population. It's important to know to realise that projections are just projections. They're not crystal balls to see into the future, but governments like to make us believe that these things are all completely inevitable. Well, they're not, and we need to be aware of that and do something about it. So, next one, please. But some people think the ACT's biggest problem is its kangaroo population. It's not the new suburbs, the new roads, the new airport. It's not the additional schools, hospitals and houses or all the new cars that threaten Canberra's grasslands. It's the eastern grey kangaroos. It seems that it is better to have cattle in Canberra's nature parks than kangaroos. Next. So, ecological cattle grazing is now being trialled. Cattle can be more easily moved than kangaroos, according to John Fletcher, who's a senior ecologist with the ACT root management program. Next, please. Despite this, in his thesis, Fletcher wrote of how 70 pregnant cows and 4 bulls grazed for 10 weeks at Tidbinbilla after a bushfire in January 2003, and they reduced the area to the lowest herbage mass recorded on any site during the study. It was very interesting to see, to read the senior ecologist's thesis, Population Dynamics of Eastern Grey Kangaroos in Temperate Grasslands, because it's the background, as far as I can see, to the ACT policy, but strangely it doesn't support it. So next, please. Just here, there's an ACT plan for growth that was conceived in 2004. I don't know how many people are aware of it. Okay, so it has a series of maps. That's the urban capable land, the yellow bits. And then there's another one that can be superimposed. That's the wildlife corridors, those yellow arrows. And I think it's, I really wonder if Canberra is serious about its wildlife corridors. Nobody knows about them, or if they do, they say that they're not very viable except for parts of them. And I would suggest that it's extremely important for people who care about the earlier plans for a city that had wild animals in it and living with nature, that they target the issue of wildlife corridors very vigorously before they're built over. Next, please. Okay, so here is the reasoning about why culling is better than harvesting. I invite you to consider it. The model indicates that commercial harvesting at the maximum level allowed results in a sustainable harvest of kangaroos, but does not increase the herbage mass and only slightly reduces the frequency of crashes when herbage mass falls to low levels. Jumping to the next paragraph. However, an alternative national park damage mitigation formula, which holds kangaroo density to about 1 per hectare, is predicted to increase herbage mass considerably and to reduce the frequency of crashes. But these effects would be achieved at the cost of having to shoot large numbers of kangaroos. Well, you recognise that that's what's happening now. That's what's been happening for a few years. And it's actually a greater rate of shooting than that which is permitted in commercial harvesting. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? Now, why would they want that? If commercial harvesting is sustainable, why are they reducing the numbers below commercial harvesting numbers, or why do they wish to? Next, please. Thanks. The model and the reality. The A.C.T. roo management model is one of high fertility, sedentary populations that rarely migrate, grazing grasslands down to the subsoil. But in his 2006 thesis, Dr. Fletcher tested this model and found to his surprise that the study did not provide evidence that high densities of kangaroos reduce ground cover to the levels where erosion can accelerate. Unmanaged kangaroo populations did not necessarily result in low levels of ground cover. Ground cover had a positive but not significant relationship to kangaroo density, which was the highest cover, with the highest cover at the wettest site where kangaroo density was highest, and then weather was a big influence. So he further said the results from the study as a whole indicate that unmanaged kangaroo populations did not necessarily result in unacceptably low levels of ground cover. Furthermore, he was working with the densest populations of kangaroos that had ever been studied. They were 5 or 6 per hectare. They didn't destroy the ground cover and they didn't starve to death. Next, please. So another part of this business of sedentary populations is the idea that these kangaroos don't migrate, and so when you count them, you're counting a population that's always there, so you're not running a risk of counting visitors or blow-ins. However, DNA studies in 2003, which was the same year that Fletcher was doing his last year's study, found that mitochondrial DNA samples indicated that there was quite a high migration factor, much higher than had previously been thought, that kangaroos moved up to 230 kilometres quite frequently, whereas previously people thought maybe 50, and that females, whilst they tended to remain in their own, close to their home grounds or whatever they call them, they still migrated quite a lot. And the figures for all individuals, male and female, go up to around 59.30. So this contradicted field study opinion that migration was low in eastern grey kangaroos and especially low in females at the A.C.T. Tidbin Biller featured in the Zenga et al. Study, that is the DNA study that showed that. Now, as far as I can see, the A.C.T. Scientists don't go into DNA studies, but I think they should. Because all new technology isn't necessarily better than the old technology, but in this case you can get a much clearer picture. You're not getting a snapshot with DNA, you actually get an historical picture of the evolution of a population. The next one, it just gives you the reference, which is Zenga et al. published in Heredity, and oh, I meant the next one. Sorry. So that's just your source if you're interested, but I'll probably publish this on a website called kangaroos.net eventually. Okay, so next, if you wouldn't mind. And here's a really interesting thing that just hasn't been investigated by the A.C.T. room managers, as far as I can see, and that's the paradoxical impact of culls, kills and harvests. Harvesting, damage mitigation, which is farmers shooting, and culling probably actually accelerate population growth in roos because the smaller ones survive and adapt by sexually maturing earlier, which speeds up fertility turnover. There's lots of work about this. Most of it's about fish, but there are a couple of articles about kangaroos in Australia. They seem to be written by people who are in the meat trade, or scientists who are favourable to it. So they kind of try to say, well, it's all right if the kangaroos get smaller, and it's nothing wrong with population growth, and they'll probably survive droughts better. I mean, I'm generalising, but so there is some very small research done into that in Australia. But just looking into this, I didn't begin with this impression, but I came away with the impression that there's an industry composed of various people that just doesn't want to rock the boat. And if they were to look at the effects of harvesting and shooting, which tend to target the biggest animals and can't actually so easily get the small ones, they would have to look into this. Any competent science studying a population of kangaroos would have to look into this. Why aren't they? Okay, Tidbinbilla, which is one of the 3 sites that Fletcher studied, is the one I kind of followed most. It was the most fertile green site. He noted that the animals there were smaller, they ate less, they were more numerous and more fecund, and they, or fecund, or however you say it, and they reproduced earlier. To my mind, you know, to me that signals smaller. They're probably a population that's been affected by shooting. And Fletcher also, in his literature surveys and so on, he said when he was estimating how much each kangaroo would eat on average, he looked at other people's previous estimates. And you have different estimates for shot populations and natural populations. That is, shot populations, populations that have been affected by commercial harvesting, are a lot smaller than the other ones. And anyone who's been to Queensland and has seen kangaroos in Queensland and kangaroos in Victoria would notice they're like pygmies in Queensland, or that's how they strike me. So I thought, you know, maybe the Tidbinbilla population is a population that's been affected by shooting. There certainly is a history of shooting. There were over 300 shot just prior to Fletcher starting his study, as I understand it in the book, because they were in danger of starving, it seemed, was the reason. The other thing is that if there's high migration, then it is quite likely that the kangaroos coming to Tidbinbilla come from a long way away. They could be coming from northern New South Wales, where they've had commercial harvesting for ages. So are you looking at a natural population? What are you looking at? So, and are you looking at a bunch of kangaroos that always stay in Tidbinbilla? Unlikely, because they've got the same profile as every other kangaroo all down the east coast until you hit northern Queensland. Stop me if you don't understand what I'm saying. The next thing I wanted to say was, oh, all right, yeah. I was going to jump to something else, but I suppose I should go on to say wider research base is needed. Can we go on to through a few? If you wouldn't mind, thanks. Keep going. Oh no, go back. Back. Sorry, if you can. All right, so wider research basis is needed, and I think the A.C.T. needs to stop culling and widen its research base in order to consider various genetically based behaviours that naturally restrain fertility opportunities in kangaroos. They're just not looking at it. Why not? Known examples include incest avoidance, which limits breeding unless animals can disperse to their own territory, and sexual segregation and gender pathways where male and female populations live apart. So I'll go into incest avoidance as a spatial limiter. Most of the literature on this is to demonstrate genetic diversity. So they will look at whether animals go away from their parents seeking genetic diversity, like is it a drive to be more genetically diverse. What actually seems to happen is that most animals avoid incestuous relations, and animals where they have that have been studied, their hormones have been studied, for instance, for carps. If they're near their mother and father, the females don't mature sexually, and the males don't seem to respond sexually. They, in other words, brother and sister aren't interested in each other, and they're not interested in their mother and father. This sort of means that the drive to disperse is to find more territory. But anyway, what happens spatially is, if you're not mating with your parents and forming a column to the moon, you're moving outwards. And what are you responding to? Well, you're probably responding via your hormones to signals in your local environment. We all know that we respond to spring, we get a bit more springy. But you know, we are animals, we respond to water, we respond to local feedback, and then our hormones probably then give a message to our genes, which have various algorithms they can pick to suit the circumstances. So you get high incest avoidance in some situations and lower incest avoidance in others. And if we just go on to the next one, please, thanks. This is actually a human incest avoidance thing. That's called a kinship rule thing. It's a mirror image, so you've got the in-laws down the right, and all the writing's backwards for the in-laws, that's how I did it. And then to the left you've got you. This is me or you, and then you've got your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Basically, all the black squares are the people you're not allowed to marry. You're not allowed to conceive with. There are variations on this. You're only allowed to conceive with the white squares. This is common to Central Australian Aboriginals. It's incest avoidance, or to the 8th cousin removed or something. It's the 8th, I've forgotten, to the 8th level. And it's also very similar in traditional South Korea, which also has moitiés. So they've got all these rules, and it's quite interesting that South Korea has not experienced the same population growth as some other countries that were suddenly industrialised. So this is a reflection of hard times, of desert times. You've got to walk a long way to find someone you can marry, and even if you're allowed to marry these couples, they might already be married. What it means is, has anyone ever seen 10 Canoes? Yeah. Do you remember the men lived in one part, the unmarried men had their quarters, and you're really lucky if you had a woman, maybe the big men had 2 or 3 women, and the women obviously had a separate gender path, so this guy falls in love with this girl, or he's interested in her, he has to lie in wait for her. When the women come by, they come by another track, and he's not meant to be there. So you've got these very separate pathways, which is a very long way of saying apparently kangaroos do too. So that's something we should follow up. I'm not sure where I'm up to now. So that's incest avoiding as a spatial limiter. Next one is possible explanation for decreased mitochondrial DNA in Queensland and northern New South Wales. Oh, we'll keep going. These are just references. Okay. Harvesting has gone on for a long time in these regions. Actually, if we could go on a bit more, there are some pictures. More, further. Okay, this is where the DNA samples were taken. If we go to the next one, that's kangaroo. That's the commercial industry map. And so if we go to the next one, that's just the New South Wales commercial industry map. This is the part that isn't generally under the. And the next one. Okay, this is a really interesting DNA map. These are all the southern kangaroos going up to South New South Wales. And then you get to northern New South Wales and Queensland. You have almost no genetic diversity. To me, that mirrors where the kangaroo meat industry is. Down here, you have highly diverse kangaroos. It's something that we should be investigating. That may not be the explanation, but it's certainly a pretty amazing picture. And so I wonder whether those kangaroos are just small and have very little genetic diversity because the little ones are growing up quickly, breeding quickly, don't move very far, don't have the same inhibitions because their parents are dead, they're orphans, and just marry their sisters. You know, that seems to be maybe what's happening. So, let's see. All right, finally, sexual segregation, gender separation. I was just going to say that the tip-in-billa kangaroos apparently had a predominance of females, and this happens in kangaroo populations. And indeed, perhaps what it signifies is that that's female land for kangaroos. We need to look into that too. So, do female kangaroos have their own places that they go to? I think it's highly likely. And so when we're looking at the outcome for kangaroos, if we're going to be taking out more and more territory for human infrastructure and human commerce, we're going to be squeezing those animals and they're not going to have their separate sex territories. So they're just going to be thrown together, so they're losing yet another inhibition on breeding, if indeed they're breeding so fast as we're told. So I'll just conclude there. I'm not sure, it was about half an hour, wasn't it? And say I think that we really have to get onto the wildlife corridors and ask for better research into those things. Thank you.
So if there's any questions, actually, Sheila, just whilst Marcus is getting set up. Fair bit of technical stuff there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I could ask about your opinion on the sustainability of kangaroos. If you have, say, a mob of 400 kangaroos in a nature reserve, and you go along and shoot 350, what's going to happen to the other 50 which are in disparate families within that mob?
Well, I think all sorts of things are going to happen. Firstly, you're probably going to be removing the elders, so you're going to be removing all sorts of order from that society. The young ones are less likely to survive. You're going to have a population which is more likely to be small because they'll reproduce without the big ones. All the things I said, did I leave something out?
No, it's just a thought, because one of the aims of the Kangaroo Management Plan is to have a sustainable population of kangaroos in the Canberra Nature Park.
Indeed, but that's not a sustainable population. That's a distorted, fragmented population.
Yeah.
And if I'm correct, and harvesting makes animals reproduce faster and smaller, and I think that's what's happening. They're just making the populations breed faster and faster and faster and faster. The more they cull, the more the little ones will breed. Yeah.
Thanks.
Isn't it also known that the female kangaroo can actually put on populations, especially in conditions like drought? Kangaroo is one of the most amazing species that can actually self-monitor its own population depending on food and substance.
They say it's particularly the red ones, but the grey ones do too.
Yeah, so I was with wives for 10 years, and one of the things that we've learned was, that they were self-sustaining.
That's right, and the little ones dying because of lack of maternal learning. Did you ever see faces in the mob?
Yeah.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? So, and presumably if they had a normal structure, they would not initiate those blastocysts. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Sheila. That's very much appreciated.